Hello, and welcome to In Focus. Today, Europe is strengthening its defenses against a threat Ukraine has faced for years: drones. Germany is upgrading airport protection, while the Kremlin is intensifying its information war, as Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russia continues to grow. A drone carrying explosives was discovered near a Ukrainian Antonov aircraft at one of Europe's largest cargo airports. The incident has pushed Germany to accelerate counter-drone measures and highlighted how Ukraine's battlefield experience is becoming increasingly valuable for the defense of Europe.
A drone carrying explosives and a detonator found near a Ukrainian Antonov aircraft at one of Europe's key cargo airports. The incident happened in the early hours of August 5th at Germany's Leipzig/Halle Airport. It is Germany's second largest cargo airport and the fourth largest in Europe, handling almost 1.5 million tons of freight a year. It is also DHL's main European hub, the home base of Ukraine's Antonov Airlines, and a facility used by NATO and EU military transport aircraft. The southern runway was closed for some time as the investigation got underway. Federal authorities have already announced that drone detection and protection systems at German airports will be upgraded on an accelerated schedule.
Frankfurt and Munich are now better equipped in this regard. But when it comes to other airports, we cannot afford to lose time. I want to speed up the further deployment of these systems as much as possible. The German Air Traffic Control Service is responsible for the safety of the airspace around airports. Early detection of drones is, of course, crucial. Stefan Bilger, German Transport Minister, in comments to Politico.
There is currently no direct evidence linking Russia to the incident. However, a number of details point to a high level of professionalism on the part of those involved, according to an investigation by Die Zeit. Germany's Interior Ministry says the country may be facing a hybrid attack scenario, a situation in which there is formally no war, but critical infrastructure is disrupted or blocked.
We are dealing with a confrontation in which foreign states may also be involved. This will be part of the investigation. The actions are clearly aimed at creating significant uncertainty in Germany, not only at airports, but elsewhere as well, and not only through the use of drones, but through other measures too. This is part of the hybrid threat landscape we are facing today.
Experts believe the organizers should be sought in Moscow, and the Kremlin may have a specific calculation when it comes to timing. State parliamentary elections in several German federal states are scheduled for September 2026. The pro-Russian and anti-Western Alternative for Germany, or AfD, continues to gain popularity. More than half of Germans believe that an AfD candidate could become a state premier in at least one federal state, according to a poll by YouGov.
The entire range of tools for influencing public opinion and politicians is part of the arsenal Russia uses and will continue to use. In Germany, we can see that public sentiment is showing fairly strong support for the AfD. There are elections coming up in several German federal states, creating tension, increasing fear, and playing on people's emotions. These are also traditional tools used by the Kremlin.
Finland is preparing for a similar scenario. Moscow could use Ukrainian drones captured as war trophies to stage provocations against NATO, Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen has warned. The aim, according to Finnish authorities, would be to weaken political, economic, and military support for Ukraine among its partners, and to test the alliance's resilience.
Our intelligence and sensor networks, our defense capabilities, and our readiness must be assessed and maintained around the clock. Finns should remain calm, but we must be prepared to deal with these drones, as well as with more unusual incidents. Antti Häkkänen, Finnish Defense Minister, in comments to Ilta-Sanomat.
Germany, Finland, and Moldova, three countries that are not participating in the war, but are already having to deal with Russian drones. For Europe, this means that the line of Russian attacks no longer coincides with the front line. Drone detection is no longer simply a technical issue for airports. It has become part of the defense of the continent. The system Germany is only beginning to build is something Ukraine has been testing in combat conditions since 2022. And today, Ukraine has the largest practical experience in Europe when it comes to countering drones. Reported by Andriy Dimitrenko, UATV News.
While European countries are adapting to a growing hybrid threat, the Kremlin is trying to control the narrative surrounding the war. Instead of explaining why Russia continues the invasion, Moscow increasingly claims that Ukraine and the West are responsible for the lack of peace. But Ukraine's growing ability to strike deep inside Russia is making that narrative harder to sustain.
We do not plan to occupy Ukrainian territories. We do not intend to impose anything on anyone by force.
This statement was made a few hours before Russian troops invaded Ukraine. 4.5 years later, losses of the Russian army, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, have exceeded 1,460,000 people. The goals of the war have not changed, but the narrative about it has. Now the Kremlin explains to its audience that the war has lasted so long, not because Moscow won't end it, but because Ukraine allegedly refuses to accept the Russian version of peace. This shift in emphasis was needed for a specific reason. Inside Russia, the war has stopped being something distant.
Russians are increasingly speaking out against the continuation of the war. Moreover, all the latest polls show that most Russians today want an immediate end to the war.
These sentiments have been influenced by Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries and logistics centers, the fuel crisis, attacks on Wildberries warehouses, and rumors of a new wave of mobilization, notes the Moscow Times. In other words, fuel, deliveries, prices, and the risk of receiving a draft summons, things Russians encounter personally. The war is increasingly spilling into everyday life, deepening a sense of uncertainty and undermining belief that the Kremlin is capable of achieving its stated goals, experts assess.
In today's Russia, no one can feel safe anymore. Now is the time to remember that the main electoral motive that drove people to vote for Putin en masse a quarter century ago was a demand for security. Russians elected Putin precisely because he promised them a peaceful life, without explosions and killings, without homes collapsing and cities burning. And so the dialectic played out, from promises of security to the complete destruction of that very security. It was deception on a truly epic scale. Abbas Galyamov, political expert, on Telegram.
Hence the new propaganda line. It is not Moscow that is waging war, but Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has allegedly lost all touch with reality and is seeking escalation. Against this backdrop, Russia's deputy foreign minister complained about strikes by Ukraine's defense forces on Russian energy infrastructure and demanded a response from the West. This complaint itself is telling. Moscow is publicly acknowledging that Ukrainian deep strikes are working.
We hope this will be followed by an adequate reaction from the international community, including from the United States and European countries, which have influence over the Kiev regime. Mikhail Galuzin, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, in an interview with TASS.
The second narrative line is aimed not at Russians, but at audiences in the US and Europe. This is the narrative of Western fatigue and a scaling back of support for Ukraine. The triggers were Donald Trump's remarks that additional Patriot systems are needed by the United States itself. Reports of Elon Musk's alleged refusal to provide Starlink for guiding Ukrainian strikes, and statements about shortages of certain types of American ammunition amid the war with Iran. Each report on its own is real. The campaign works by stripping away context and the actual mechanisms of military assistance.
Russian and pro-Russian resources selectively combine these reports, creating an artificial impression of a systemic rollback of military aid to Ukraine. Tactical decisions, individual statements, or weapons stockpile issues are presented as a final strategic abandonment of support for Ukraine by the West, from a statement by the Center for Strategic Communications on Telegram.
Propaganda and lies remain a working tool of war and discrediting Ukraine for Russia, say officials at the Center for Countering Disinformation under Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. The goal is to portray Ukraine as the aggressor, killing civilians, while simultaneously keeping out of frame how many children and civilians the Russian occupiers have killed in Ukraine.
Today, the main obstacle on the path to peace is Putin himself, because it is he who wants to continue this war indefinitely, because an endless war is precisely an endless extension of his power.
Russians increasingly do not believe that Putin has a realistic plan or that the army is capable of winning, and the dictator's ratings are falling, experts say. That is why the Kremlin is now fighting not only on the front line, but also over the interpretation of the war. Russia must be portrayed as the victim, while Ukraine and its allies must be portrayed as the ones who don't want peace. And this campaign has a weak point. The claim of Western fatigue does not describe reality. It is trying to create it. It will only work if Western audiences and politicians come to believe it. Reported by Natalia Husak, UATV News.
Russia is facing a growing problem on two fronts. Its military pressure is producing diminishing returns, while Ukraine is expanding its ability to strike back and expose the Kremlin's vulnerabilities. And as Moscow tries to sell the image of strength, its actions increasingly reveal a country searching for ways out of a war it has failed to win. Thank you for watching In Focus. If you enjoyed this episode, then make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next one.